Friends, welcome to the second part of Violence, Nonviolence, and Peacemaking, as we have Katy Gray Brown and Virginia Rendler from Manchester University, joining us tonight, continuing what was a great first part of the course last week, and now we have the second part. Glad you all are here. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Katy and Virginia for you all to take us down all the paths that I hope we have time to cover tonight. Thank you for coming back.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being back and coming back for part 2 of our series. I am going to start with sharing my screen. I'm wondering if we should do any kind of just making sure that everyone is able to access the chat. If everybody just wants to say hey, or something you're thinking about this evening, just a little check-in. And while we do that, I'll go ahead and get started with the process that is sharing my screen. Let's see here. Advanced. That's me in the corner. Okay. All right. Yes, thank you. And as always, feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat, or just unmute. I welcome you to just interrupt me or raise a hand or do whatever. Thanks to everyone for sharing where you're tuning in from and saying hey. Really glad you're all here tonight. This is night 2. We were gathered together here just a week ago. I'm going to tell you some of the things that we talked about last week, just to go over it really quickly. Then I'll take you through a quick little discussion of direct versus indirect violence and some of the language we use around theories of violence. We'll do a little breakout discussion, and then I'll pass it over to Katy. So if you'll remember, last week we talked a little bit about the Peace Studies program specifically at Manchester and Manchester College and Manchester University history, some of the legacies of the Peace Studies program here, and about other Peace Studies programs that have sprung up around the globe. We talked about the curriculum of Peace Studies, what fits within the scope of the academic field of peace studies. And then we got into some of the theory about kind of different types of peace, negative and positive peace, the different levels of peacemaking that we talked about. And then we had a wonderful discussion about the definition of violence and what fits in that scope. We talked a lot last week about kind of the definitions of violence and how we understand that. And this week we'll talk more about nonviolence. But first, I am going to talk more about violence. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Here we are. It's day 2. Okay. So I'm going to talk, I'm going quickly, so I hope that we can cover everything. But if I'm going too fast, please feel free to say slow down. I'm going to try to make it snappy. We're talking a little bit here about conflict theory. So we talked about kind of peace and what those different levels of peacemaking are, and we're kind of going to give that same treatment to violence here. This is kind of a leftover from last week that we're bringing in this week. So in peace studies, we talk about the difference between direct and indirect violence. And it's pretty intuitive, these definitions, that direct violence is overt human-initiated physical harm. So we think of that as kind of like one-on-one violence that's inflicted from one person consciously to another person. So we've got different levels of direct violence here, kind of in the same categories that we talked about last week for peacemaking. So we've got big, medium, and large, or meso, micro, and macro. A lot of the violence that we're looking at within direct violence happens on the micro or meso level because it's in between two people. So on the one-on-one or interpersonal level, our smallest level of our concentric circles, we have things like domestic violence, murder, some of those things that you fist fighting, maybe some of the more typical things that come to mind when you think about violence, or as you kind of first learn about violence. On a kind of a larger scale, we have things like police attacks, military attacks, imprisonment, things that happen directly to a person, but are perpetrated kind of on a larger level or a more broad scale. So that's direct violence, something that happens to someone. Usually it's an individual or a group on group type of situation. But we also have, I have to get smaller, we also have indirect violence, which includes two categories, structural and cultural. So we have these categories that fit within indirect violence, and indirect violence is more of the types of violence that come within a society or aren't that direct, overt violence. So we've got structural violence is kind of the structures that are in place, how these structures affect people in a way that causes harm. And cultural violence are the ethnic and ideological beliefs that kind of normalize that structural inequality. So for structural violence, we're thinking things that happen on a systemic level, like malnutrition, mass incarceration, slavery, systemic discrimination. And cultural violence are kind of the underlying philosophies that are in society that can kind of create the basis or the justification for these violences. So we think about racism perhaps as a cultural violence that perpetrates the structural violence that is mass incarceration. So those are the ways that we would kind of use those terms together and how they play into each other. So we're going to take some of these terms and we're going to go into a breakout room and we're going to try to apply them. Okay. This is kind of, we want to give some space to talk about the conflict in Ukraine and Russia and the things that are going on in Eastern Europe, and use kind of this new language around violence to see if we can analyze that in a kind of a way that fits in with conflict theory. Oh my goodness, look at this little triangle. Okay, so this is a helpful little graphic here that kind of talks about how we see this violence. That I think this is helpful to think about. Direct violence is something that you can directly see that is pretty obvious when it's happening and where it's happening, and that the camera being flipped messes me up. That the cultural violence and structural violence are kind of the bottom, the basis of that triangle, but that are invisible and aren't seen to the naked eye, but require kind of more systemic and in-depth look at structures in society. So in breakout rooms of a few folks, I think 3 or 4, whatever works for the split, we're going to give you some time to talk about these kind of categories, structural, cultural, and direct violence, and some time to use those new terms to analyze the situation in Eastern Europe. And I really encourage you to just kind of explore what it is that you know about that situation and the ways that maybe structural or cultural violence kind of inform the direct violence that's happening there. I don't know, Katie, do you have anything to add from that section or anything about this question?
Well, and if you wish, you can discuss the connections between these types of violence in different contexts as well, right? So you can discuss ways that cultural violence and structural violence and direct violence are coming out in this conflict, in the armed conflict right now in Ukraine. Or if you want to talk about examples of those connections in the United States context, that's fine too.
Awesome. So I will stop sharing my screen right now. There we go. And we'll head into our breakout rooms as long as wait, does anybody have any questions before we go? If you get into your breakout room and you're like, I don't know what we're talking about, you can just come back and we'll do that.
How long will we be in breakout rooms?
Good question. Let's do, how long do we think? 5 to 7 minutes. I'm whispering as if it's like less of a commitment. Let's say 6 or 7 minutes. We'll just see kind of, and people can come back when they're done if you finish up early. Thanks. I think we're ready to go.
Great. I'll go ahead and put everyone in their breakout rooms, and you may not be able to come back on your own, but I'll bring you back when it's time. So, okay, here we go. And here we go. Welcome back, folks.
All right. Looks like we got almost everybody's back. It's like more people than we started out with when we went to the breakout rooms. You've multiplied. I am interested to hear what you talked about. I know we didn't ask you to designate a reporter or anything, but I would be happy to hear just who had a good conversation or has something they want to share.
Well, the time went very quickly for us, but a couple of things that stood out. A question of like, what is trying to be accomplished and what are the motives, and that could lead to violence, but it's not completely evident what's being tried to accomplish. And then someone really made a profound, well, Colleen really made a profound insight that they share a culture for the most part. There's certainly some differences, but there's a very close cultural share, but they are politically very divided. And so what's contributing to the violence by having such a shared culture, but being so politically different?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
I just want to ask, like, well, isn't political divisiveness part of culture? I mean, I would say some people really see it as, unfortunately, part of their culture is those that think like them politically. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about structural violence and the parts of our culture that are inherently kind of allow us to be more predisposed towards violence, that it's important to apply that to the political system and use that to look at kind of political parties and the way that we have our country set up and the way that divisiveness makes our differences seem that much starker, and the opportunities for the way that may lay foundations for violence and has for, you know, basically our entire history of our country.
Carolyn Schrock, are you willing to tell your story of generational violence, where the person who was killed wasn't even a part of the feud that was going on? Are you willing to tell that story?
Sure, I'll try to be a little briefer. We have brethren people working in South Sudan, so this story comes from there. There was a pastor that was called out of his house one night and murdered. And in the attempt to try to find, for the police or whoever, to try to find the guilty party, they arrested people of the church who this pastor belonged to, that they were having like a district conference in town. And a couple of our people had helped to deliver guests to this pastor's house to spend the evening. When district conference is there and there's lots of people, then they have to be put up in the homes. And so they were suspicious for some reason because they had delivered guests to this house. And so they were arrested and kept in prison for weeks with no charge. Anyway, long story short, come to find out, this pastor was murdered because of some family feud, two different families feuding a generation or two earlier. And it was decided by the victim of that feud, that family's feud, that this pastor was the appropriate person to be murdered for that, to pay for that, whatever had happened a long time ago in that feud. So he was innocent, totally innocent. He just happened to belong to the family that the other family felt needed to pay retribution. So that's an example of direct culture with direct violence with a cultural underlying.
Were there other examples that of ways that connect the idea of direct violence with structural violence and cultural violence?
We talked some in our group about the sovereignty of other countries and not wanting to recognize them. And as we all know, the United States has been guilty of not recognizing the sovereignty of the Native Americans and the sovereignty of their countries and their borders and their cultures. And so that's what kind of violence that is, but it was wrong. Whatever. It was just, we don't appreciate it when other countries don't want to recognize the sovereignty of nations, i.e. Ukraine wanting to be an independent country, but yet we did the same thing to our Native American brothers and sisters.
Mary had an example in our group of area where she lived. It was like a threat of violence as you drove through. I don't know if she'd like to share that as an example.
Mary, you're still muted.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the laptop, so I'm on my phone. I brought up, the main question was, how could the entire Ukrainian government not know after 8 years that the separatists or the insurrectionists would not be undermining the democracy to the point where this uprising and this conflict would come? And I was saying that we as Americans are not fully aware of all of the fractionist groups that are trying to undermine our own government, and how I had an awareness of that 30 years ago when I went to go to my great-great-grandparents' homestead 50 miles from Hershey, PA, in a state forested area, and my Grandpa Smith's 2-acre farm was the only acreage that wasn't owned by neo-Nazis, and that I never returned to that area because every 50 yards or so, it's posted that you must enter that area armed because all neighbors surrounding you are armed, and how that fear of that type of racist and bigotry, I didn't want to expose my then 4 and 10-year-old to ever again. So it is a cultural thing, and it's also a structural thing that sometimes we're just not aware of the internal factions that are anti-government.
Our group talked about how ethnic jokes or racial slurs or, just general meanness can snowball into cultural then, because like kids grow up hearing it and think it's normal, and then how structural violence can cause cultural violence, like how they're so intertwined. I don't know, we had many examples if anybody from my group wants to talk about them more.
I was in Susan's group and got to jump in and listen to a lot of that. There were examples of things like, racism targeted towards African Americans left over from the slavery, Jim Crow laws, leading into continued structural issues of not being able to get housing or not being able to get education, not being able to get jobs, and how then that creates pockets of poverty and hopelessness and a need to pull out things like, survival versus thriving type of skills that can lead to direct violence in the other direction, or can perpetuate then, so you turn to drugs, but then you re-encounter the structural situation that drugs are treated differently in the court system than maybe they should, and it creates all sorts of intertwined, perpetuating circles that serve to continue to reintroduce violence into the lives of people caught in it.
Yeah, Sandra and Susan, that's exactly the relational dynamic that we were looking for when we were imagining this triangle and the connections between the points of the triangle. The idea that the cultural violence of white supremacy feeds into systemic policies such as racial profiling in policing, which feeds into direct violence in terms of police brutality and the use of force and the killing of people of color by police. And it's that relationship among these different types of violence that we need to be aware of so that we can interrupt different places in that cycle. And when I was sketching some ideas, Virginia came up with this idea of imagining the situation in Ukraine, the war there, as the direct violence, and what sorts of structural violence and cultural violence were related to it. The cultural violence, I think, that I came up with was this idea that Ukraine is Russian, right? And that the long-standing ethnic and cultural ties translates into a national identity in the same way. So there's this cultural erasure of Ukraine in a way that is cultural violence. And then the structural violence, I thought, was the propaganda that normal Russians are given and the censorship of the media in Russia, so that people really don't have a sense of what's going on. And it's very difficult for ordinary Russians to understand the response of the people of the Ukraine to the armies that are invading there now. So that was an example that I came up with. Any last reflections on this or on the difficulties? Was one kind of violence harder to come up with than the others? Often in our classes, it's harder to come up with the structural violence because those policies are so embedded into our systems that it's sometimes difficult for us to identify the ways that policies and practices systemically disadvantage and oppress certain people and privilege other peoples. So it's the structural violence that seems the most difficult to identify and the hardest to change.
I must say that's probably because it's white people in those classes, though. If you asked people that are the on the brunt end of those policies, they know much more what they are. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you ready to move to the next section, Virginia, which involves another screen share? We're trading this off. My my camera is not as powerful. I need to ask first if I can get permission to share, and I've got it. My screen is my camera is not as powerful as Virginia's, and so I don't have the in-screen capacity that is as cool as hers. But I'm going to bring up some slides that talk about opposing violence. Here we go. And start with a general acknowledgement that in looking philosophically at questions of violence, there is across cultures and times a general ethical prohibition on murder, right? That often when we're talking about violence, there is a sense that violence somehow must be justified. It's an aberration of sort of relationships as usual. We see this in terms of both on an individual level and on a societal level. There are questions about, when is violence justified? And even putting the question that way indicates that there is an expectation that in general we will act non-violently towards each other. Right? But see if this forwards for me. We're talking about really a rejection of violence, absolutely. And here, the question is then, why would someone reject violence without qualification? Why would someone remove violence as a legitimate option in any specific case? And there are two major strands to this response. The reasons that someone might absolutely reject violence as a legitimate response in a certain situation. And the first position is this idea that violence is wrong, and therefore is not a legitimate option, even in a situation where someone or a community is facing significant oppression. Now this is a position, and here are some lines. I'm already against the next war, one of my favorite bumper stickers, the symbol of the War Resisters League. These are expressions of a position that in the field we would call principled nonviolence, right? And this is the position that violence is wrong on a moral level, and so it can't be seen as a legitimate response. There are two ways to sort of come to this position of principled nonviolence. The first is on the basis of a religious conviction, right, or a faith tradition. This might be the kind of nonviolence that feels most familiar to us, or that we've been exposed to, that people, because of a certain theological understanding or religious conviction, reject violence as a legitimate option, and is seen as immoral in a way that removes it as a viable consideration for us. Right? The Fellowship of Reconciliation is an example of an interfaith peace organization, a pacifist movement that draws together people of different faiths, the Jewish Peace Fellowship, the Muslim Peace Fellowship, the religious tradition of the Jains and the Buddhists, and then Christian nonviolence, right? all of these religious faiths have strands within them that have traditionally rejected violence as a legitimate option. Even traditions that have seen a legitimate role for violence in certain circumstances have prescribed limitations on when those circumstances are available or options. Okay? So principled nonviolence from a religious basis is something with which we are familiar, especially in the context of a peace church like the Brethren tradition. But you can also have a principled position, a principled opposition to violence that is based on secular beliefs. It doesn't require religious faith to have an outright rejection of violence as a legitimate option. Okay? So there have been people from a philosophical position and commitment to human rights and the idea of human rights that have rejected violence as a legitimate option. Or there have been people who, on the basis of their understanding of class identity or just this idea of being a global citizen and having allegiance to people and to communities rather than to nation states, such as Eugene Debs, that from a purely secular understanding of the world have also rejected violence as a legitimate option. Okay, so in principled nonviolence, the understanding is that violence is wrong and it's rejected because it's immoral in any case. But there's also a strain in nonviolence theory that embraces nonviolence, that rejects violence for different reasons. And this is referred to as strategic nonviolence or sometimes pragmatic nonviolence. And adherents to strategic nonviolence just believe that violence isn't as effective at reaching one's goals, right? So it's rejected on those grounds. Nonviolence is embraced on those grounds because it works better pragmatically as a tool to achieving our goals. And there's a rich tradition of examples of strategic nonviolence being used, not on philosophical or religious grounds, but because it will be more effective at achieving its ends. It's a very practical approach. Okay? And so some of the pictures here indicate are illustrating different protests that chose nonviolence as a tactic because it would just allow them to achieve their objectives in a way that violence never would. So these two strands they're separated just to highlight some of the differences that people bring to a commitment to nonviolence. In most movements and in the lives of most practitioners, they are greatly intertwined. Right? It's more of a theoretical separation than a living separation. So we have people such as Martin Luther King or Mohandas Gandhi or Barbara Deming who are affiliated with principled nonviolence. We have people like Cesar Chavez and Gene Sharp who are more closely associated with strategic nonviolence. And yet Chavez and Gene Sharp both came from philosophical traditions and religious traditions that encouraged nonviolence, that rejected nonviolence on moral grounds. Gandhi and King both used nonviolence very strategically as an effective means to an end. But it's significant in, as we talk to other people about the motivations that bring us to reject violence, we understand that these are different ways we can talk about nonviolence to people who may be skeptical of nonviolence as a method.
It looks like we've got a raised hand.
Great. And I can't see that. Oh, it's Susan.
It's me. Hi.
Hey.
I'm just, I could say with the looting and rioting that happened after George Floyd was killed, strategically, it wasn't a good idea. I understand desperation and they had the right intention, but strategically, I think they hurt their cause more than others. But then there's like, okay, what does Ukrainians do? I find myself struggling, saying, wow, look at them making Molotov cocktails. They're going to defend their country. That's great. And then I think, wait, that's just more violence. I don't want that, Or looking at drones today, they're getting military equipment. How great, but they don't have an option. It's die or give up their country or fight back. And you see these videos of the mayors standing there, let's fight, and people leaving their families, and it's just so sad. But what option do they have for nonviolence at this point?
We are completely going to come back to that in our last section of the discussion tonight, because this question of what options is one of the most significant challenges that advocates for nonviolence meet, right? That there is a skepticism of the ability for nonviolence to bring about effective change, especially in the face of an authoritarian regime with one of the greatest militaries of the world. So we're gonna address this question. In any case, though, we need to remind ourselves when we're slipping into a false dichotomy of either people use violence or they don't do anything. And we have to also remember this whole debate about the destruction of property and whether or not the destruction of property constitutes violence. And in the field, there's plenty of discussion and debate about this. There's not agreement, but there's a significant argument to be made to say that the destruction of property that's used to inflict violence would constitute as a nonviolent tactic, right? So in World War II, when Denmark was occupied by Germany, the Danes would blow up the train tracks, blow up the railroads that were used to get materials from shipyards to Germany and the like. That was destruction of property, but was it in the spirit of a nonviolent movement? And there are theorists who would say yes. Sometimes the destruction of property can, with integrity, be part of a nonviolent campaign, a nonviolent resistance movement. But I want to bring this over to Virginia because all of nonviolence here is working from either principled or strategic, working from a fundamentally different understanding of power than a violent framework is, or a conventional understanding of power and force, meaning the use of violence. So I want to shift over to Virginia to see if you would lead us through that.
Yes, I would love to. Can I share my screen? Perfect. Let me just do that. Let's see if I got my slides split right. Okay, here I am in the corner. Okay. So like Katie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about our different conceptions of power. Power is generally defined as the abilities to get others to do what you want them to do, or the ability to kind of have your will be enacted, which is an interesting thing to think about when we talk about violence, because often violence is an expression of power. Often violence is something that people who have more power over a group will use as a way to enforce that power or to gain power. As we look at these conflicts, those are interesting things to think about. So we talk about two different frameworks for understanding power. And the way that we understand power kind of affects what we think we're capable of achieving in activism. So there's one framework here that's the monolith framework. So that framework kind of works through the idea that power is stable, it's concentrated in the hands of the elite, and it's not easily controlled or moved. So when we're looking at things like government, we're saying, you know, these are the people that have the power. They hold all of the ability in society to get us to do what they want. This is kind of the framework that we've consented to. There's a large monolith, a body that's unchanging, that holds the power in its hands. And this is the way that society is set up, you know, kind of power from the top down. The power comes from a few at the top and is enacted on the larger group underneath. And then we have the consent framework, which is different because it considers power as fragile, power as depending on cooperation, and that it's dispersed across society and held by many. I encourage you to kind of think about which of these frameworks speaks best to your understanding of power. I don't think either one is wrong. So one or the other might be more useful in understanding and thinking about tactical ways to enact nonviolence. So in the consent framework, we're thinking about the ways in which we as a people hold power in numbers, hold power in skill, and we allow a group of folks to hold power over us because it allows us to engage in society in some way that we think is beneficial. But that the power really does depend on all of us continuing to give that permission to folks, or to continuing to work within that system. And the recognition that the group, I keep saying on the bottom, but I don't think that's the right phrasing, that the larger group of folks are the ones who hold the power to decide who's in charge. And I think you can see easily how this can influence our understanding of peacemaking and peace building. If we think that power exists at the top and that this is the way that things kind of are and it's unmovable, then we're going to have a harder time convincing ourselves that we can make a change, or that we can kind of inflict our will as a group on the small majority that holds the power. And if we think about ourselves as a collective that holds power in a way that's completely different to a monolithic framework, that we can understand the ways in which our consent is the powerful force behind structures like government, that can then enact violence on their people if they so choose. So I think this is helpful in understanding the ways in which activism can accomplish goals, and reminding groups that power isn't something that, you know, happens to us. It's a structure that we've consented to and continue to uphold in society. I appreciate the comments coming in the chat. Consent framework, yeah, I think that when we look at kind of examples of Russian soldiers defecting and kind of elements like that, we see that consent plays a big part, even in military operations, that where the power would be if a group of troops genuinely changed their mind about their mission, where the power would come from then at that point. And we can apply that kind of way of thinking to all different levels and power dynamics that we see in society. Let me see if I can advance my slide. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit now about the potential outcomes of nonviolent action. We're talking a little bit now about kind of the effects that nonviolent action can have. And these are positive outcomes. So effects that these different types of protest, which we'll talk about after the break, can kind of enact change. And I think this is helpful too when we think about our spectrum of allies. I have that in a slide shortly. But the way that we can enact change And the way that that looks is is different for different tactics. So the first one that we have here as a potential outcome is conversion. This is kind of changing the hearts and minds of your opponents to win them over, and converting them into allies, people who genuinely believe in your cause now. I would say that this is a great and ideal outcome. If nonviolent action would genuinely change the hearts and minds every time, that would be an amazing thing. But it doesn't always happen like that. But this is one option, that you can genuinely convince your opponent that you're right, and that the way that you see the world is the way that they now see the world. But another option is accommodation. And we kind of think about this as similar to compromise, where your opponent recognizes the advantages of negotiating with you and agrees to find a compromise that might be amenable to both sides. So when we're thinking about, different nonviolent actions or elements of protest and persuasion, one outcome might be that you have put yourself now in a position where your opponent has agreed to negotiate with you, where you can have some meeting of the minds where you come to terms, come to the same side with each other. Let's see. Yeah, some really good examples of nonviolent action. And when we're thinking about the situation in Ukraine, we can think about which of these potential outcomes might be the most likely. When we're looking at that situation, do we think that the hearts and minds of opponents will be changed, or do we think that they might come to a place where compromise is an option? But I've got some more outcomes. Another one is nonviolent coercion, where through methods that we've talked about kind of extensively here, like boycotts, sanctions, or continued physical presence or pressure, makes it so that your opponents have no choice but to change or to give in to your wishes. So I feel like this language can sound a little harsh, but when we're putting it in kind of the context of protest and persuasion, we're looking for a way to kind of move our solution forward, and that when nonviolent coercion, that putting yourself kind of doing these practices of protest and persuasion in the hopes that your opponent will realize that changing in the ways that you want them to is going to be what's best for them at that point, because you have done this kind of pressure persuasion. I love these examples in the chat. Keep giving me examples. And so the last one that we have here, I'm going to move myself. Boop. Okay, is disintegration. And that is that your opponents vanish because all resources to resist have been depleted. So we think about this as a potential outcome of sanctions or economic boycotts, that you have simply gone on for so long that they've run out of the resources to oppose you anymore, and that you have to give in, but not in the way that a violent kind of movement would do, in that you're physically subduing your opponent, but that you have made it so that their resources make it so it's impossible for them to continue their oppressive behavior. And we've got here kind of the spectrum of allies, and this is something that's helpful for thinking about the ways that we try to convert someone through these nonviolent actions. So it's helpful to kind of, when you're in the middle of a movement, to think about the people that you're opposing and where they fit on this spectrum, and where it makes sense to be hopeful that they'll move to. So active allies here on the left are the people that are on your side. Those are the people on your team. They're in the movement. They're actively fighting. Your regular old allies are people that are on your side. They might not necessarily be taking action, but they're certainly a supporter of your cause. Neutral parties, they're not really interested. They could go either way. It's not a big deal. Opponents are folks that disagree with you, but aren't necessarily taking action against you. But they're not into it. They're not catching the vibe. And active opponents are those folks that are fighting against you or directly oppressing you. And so we think about moving what's reasonable or realistic to expect when we engage in nonviolent action. And typically that involves moving someone one or two notches over. So this helps us when we're creating goals and strategies and tactics, because we can think about the fact that active opponents may never become active allies. That's not realistic to expect that an active opponent would then, through nonviolent action, become an active ally, a member of your team out there supporting your cause. But you could push them to just be an opponent, to not be actively working against you. Or you could even push them into neutrals where they see both sides of the story. If you have an ally that you know agrees with you, but isn't participating in your action, it might be worth the effort to put pressure on them to become an active ally, to become a part of your cause. Same thing for neutral party. It might be, realistic to expect that they could become an ally, or understand your point of view if you kind of engage in these practices. Opponents could be moved to neutral, etc. You get the idea. Through these nonviolent actions, you might have these outcomes with your active opponents or your opponents, or be able to move them somewhere on your spectrum of allies. And I think this is really helpful for considering strategy and tactics, but also for noting that nonviolence is a strategy or involves strategy. It's not passive. It doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing. It means kind of thinking really tactically about what you're going to do based on the situation of oppression that you're countering, and what methods make the most sense and what outcomes you might expect, and that you can modify your strategy and tactics based on what outcomes are potentially available to you and based on what allies you think you might be able to move to help support your cause. So that's a little bit about nonviolent action. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. I'm not going to leave the meeting. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, there we go. So we're halfway through. I think it's time for a 10-minute break. We'll come back after the break. We'll talk about nonviolent resistance, different types of nonviolent protest and demonstration. We'll have another breakout discussion, and then we'll talk about responding to skeptics of violence. It's going to be great. And so I hope to see you all at 8:10, or it's not 8 for all of you, the 10 o'clock time of whatever hour it is for you. Is that good? Are we all set? I'm going to catch up on the chat.
Sounds good, Virginia, for us to come back at 10 minutes after the hour, whatever hour we're at. Great, we're coming back. Katie and Virginia, you need anything, or are you good to go?
I think we're good to go. I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Thanks for coming back, everybody. Let's see, it's always taking me a second. Sure. Okay. I want to go into that yet. Okay, here I am in the corner. All right, welcome back, everybody, to our second half of our second day. I'm going to talk about different types of nonviolent resistance. So, when we think about nonviolent resistance, I think that there is a tendency in popular culture to maybe think about protest, like going out and marching, and that's a big part of it. But there's a lot of other elements and a lot of other different actions that can all come together to be, a very strategic movement, or can be done individually as a method to put pressure on a group. So let me advance to my next slide. Wow. Okay. So we're looking at 3 different types here that are helpful categories to use to kind of talk about these different methods of nonviolent direct action. So the first that we have is protest and persuasion. And I think for me, this is the one that comes the most quickly to my mind when I think about nonviolent resistance. I'm not sure if that's true for the rest of you, but it's been my experience that this is like the most kind of popular form of nonviolent resistance depicted in media. And I have a lot of photo examples of it as well. So this is, we're looking at demonstrations, we're looking at petitions and marches, things that involve kind of physically disrupting life. We talk about protest as a way to kind of get in the way of normal life, to make it hard for people to do what they would normally do on a day-to-day basis, as a way to raise awareness for a cause. So sometimes a protest will be a way to convince someone of something, if we think about political protest. And sometimes it will be a way to just demonstrate support for a cause. We have Gandhi's Salt March up here, and the Women's March as well. These are examples of demonstrations that have had different goals, but similar methods and tactics to achieve those goals. Another category is non-cooperation. So this is kind of intentionally breaking the rules in a way that advances your goal, or in a way that you feel like is required morally or ethically. So we're looking here at boycotts, conscientious objection, strikes, non-cooperation to laws or systems that you have been participating in as a way to make a point, or as a way to, enact justice. So conscientious objection fits in this category because, the law or a draft may require conscripted service, and you would be resisting that by not participating in it. And so that could be a strategic, an example of strategic nonviolence. You feel like, it would be strategically beneficial towards your goals to not participate in a war, or it could be, a personal conviction that you don't participate in war or military action. So non-cooperation is kind of this intentional breaking of the rules, or intentionally changing your action to not participate in a system in a way that draws attention to your cause or advances your cause in some way. And the third category here is nonviolent direct action or intervention. So we're looking at things like disarmament. So that might mean stealing or sometimes destroying weapons, blockades, protective presence, and accompaniment. So we talked a little bit about Christian peacemaker teams, which is now called
Community peacemaker teams.
Community peacemaker teams. So that would be an example of protective presence and accompaniment, standing next to someone to help kind of de-escalate situations of violence, or putting yourself in between an instance of violence that may be occurring. Blockades to prevent, typical life from occurring, or kind of the systems that perpetuate injustice from occurring. So that's a great question. Where would policy lobbying or going to your lawmakers go? So I think petitioning the system is probably a part of protest and persuasion. Things like lobbying would be something that fits in with kind of persuading and appealing to a higher authority to make a change. I appreciate the question. If anybody has any more examples that they want us kind of sort into a category, that would be great. And we will go into breakout room discussions of these. So if you want to take note of them and what kind of constitutes each category. I find that these categories are really helpful, again, for understanding the ways that nonviolence is strategic and does have kind of these theoretical bases that allow us to think tactically about movements, and thinking about which types of these might be best for the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So, and I think that we can see, I mean, for me, I'm thinking about blockades. I'm thinking about the situation in Canada right now with truck drivers blocking the road, and that as a method of protest. Where does not wearing a mask when mandated fit? Interesting. That's a good question. I mean, for me, my initial instinct is non-cooperation with the law or rule that's been enacted. But it's interesting to think about this question of nonviolence and the pandemic and the ways that choosing to not abide by these rules that protect other people may or may not be violent, or may or may not be putting folks at risk at the very least. I would say non-cooperation, but I think, yeah, persuasion. Yeah, for the lobbying, I think persuasion is the right one, and non-cooperation for wearing a mask. It's interesting to think about these instances that we might not consider as traditionally nonviolent or aligned with our ideology, and kind of sorting those as well and thinking about the ways that they use strategy and tactics to advance their goals. What about wearing a mask in Florida while hosting the governor? That's a good one. And I think we think about these things because they help us understand the goals and the kind of the goals and strategies of either our opponents or ourselves, and the way that those fit in with what we're trying to achieve. So we're going to talk a little bit about these different types of nonviolent resistance in breakout groups, which could be, 3 or 4 people, whatever. I'm interested to hear about your experiences with these 3 types, what you have seen kind of in your life as you're going through, as you're thinking about, what you've seen in history, and what are the strengths and challenges associated with each. So thinking about these 3 categories: protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and nonviolent direct action and intervention, and thinking about the ways that we've experienced those in culture, what we've seen as cultural movements, and how they might work or be effective or ineffective. So I think with that said, we'll do breakout rooms. Maybe, how long should we say? Did it feel too short last time? Should we do the same amount, like 6 minutes? I know it's fast, but I'm trying.
They were too short. We need 10.
Okay, 10. Okay, we'll do as close to 10 as we can possibly manage. We'll have Enton call us back maybe at 9 or 10 minutes. So that being said, let's do it.
Okay, here we go, breaking out.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm sure that wasn't enough time to finish your conversations, but I'd love to know what you did get to talking about. What sort of nonviolent strategies have you experienced, and what do you see as their strengths and weaknesses? Feel free to either type in chat or share out loud.
I shared an experience from that being on stage with a new congregation that was being introduced to the annual conference. And I guess looking at it now, I was an ally of Elizabeth, she and her wife and her family, as they were welcomed as a Church of the Brethren, but yet she's married and gay and going against everything that we're not supposed to do. But I was serving as an ally to her, but I didn't realize it would. It wasn't on my radar. It just wasn't on my radar to not do that. So standing with her as an ally, when I see your definitions, that's definitely what I was doing.
Some long years ago boycotts, not too many recently, and some more recent marches or demonstrations concerning the Black Lives Matter area.
Mm-hmm.
So growing up, my father-in-law worked in a Chrysler plant, and United Auto Workers often struck for higher wages and for increased retirement and health benefits, retired benefits. So that's one. I think if the workers do it, it's called a strike. If the owners do it, it's called a lockout, where they don't allow the workers to work. So that's one form of direct action. Going on at the congregational level, I'm a Quaker. I belong both to the Church of the Brethren, in which I'm an ordained minister, but I'm also a Quaker because there's no Church of the Brethren in the town in which I live. Quakers have an organization called Friends Committee on National Legislation. They have about 140 advocacy groups in 40 different states. They try to impact national legislation and cut down the funding for war. So that's a massive lobbying effort.
I see mentions of the School of the Americas protests in the chat. That's a great example. Use of the arts, organizing and finding common values while building relationships. All excellent examples. Yes, parents not buying grapes or Nestle products. We see some of that now still too, with things like BDS for the boycott, divest, and sanctions for the Palestinian liberation movement, with not using products like Sabra hummus or I don't know, cat, construction tools. Or HP devices. SodaStream is a good example of that.
I liked what was also in the chat that Susan noted about using arts, and that's a more recent sort of thought of doing that kind of direct action.
Yeah, we heard from Elizabeth in our group the thought that sometimes what's expressed in song can kind of slide under the radar, or that our sentiments, I'm speaking for her, but teaching as a teacher, even when she couldn't share sentiments, that could still come through in song and the arts in some ways that it's not as easy to be blatant about.
That was interesting that Sarah made a comment that her protests could be viewed as a witness. And I think I liked that relationship between protesting, even if it's a silent protest or whatever, but it's also a witness to other people around you. If you're holding hands with them, it's a witness that you are with them and you believe in what they're doing.
Well, and I remember well a model of civil disobedience from Enton when there was a reinstatement of this registration for selective service, and I believe 1980. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. And you and John Harshberger are the people I remember most clearly as making a public witness and bringing this as an issue, raising this issue and being willing to accept the consequences of that. You know, that was a powerful nonviolent witness in our community. Oh, Steve, Dale Brown said a lot of things in the chat. Steve Stone saying Dale Brown used to say marches and prayers could be seen as evangelism. It's true, he used those opportunities. And Colin Kaepernick, yes. Taking a knee during the national anthem to protest systems of white supremacy in this country. Other examples that have been meaningful to you in your lives?
Well, I think prayer vigils, candle vigils, where people stand and chant or pray can be powerful messages.
Yeah. Or even seeing the buildings around the world that are, that are yellow and blue. That's an incredible witness to what's going on, I think.
It occurs to me that while all of us can't participate in demonstrations and blockades and that kind of thing, I've been fortunate enough to live in communities where there's a significant group of people, usually the church, that is very supportive, that makes it possible for at least a few people to participate. And to me, they are allies, even if they're not out there in front.
Yes, the one of the beauties of nonviolent action is how inclusive it can be in the variety of tactics that nonviolence can employ. It doesn't restrict who can be an active supporter of a movement, and it's one of the distinctive strengths, really, nonviolent action in that way, and just the immense creativity that it encourages.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing those. And if you think of more examples, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I'm going to pass it over to Katy for our last screen sharing section to talk about some responses to skeptics of nonviolence.
Yes. And I will move back and forth from sharing a PowerPoint and then switching up to share some videos. We wanted to close with a discussion, a time to really address some of the primary arguments that we encounter as people who are committed to nonviolence. And in a way, I mean, the work of this discussion, the work of our time together has been to problematize our faith that violence can achieve the ends that we want it to achieve, and to also sort of shake off some of the skepticism that we have just culturally about nonviolence to bring about the ends that we desire. Two common responses that advocates of nonviolence or skeptics of violence will will receive are this idea that nonviolence isn't as effective or as efficient as violent in bringing about change. And then the question that arose earlier, well, nonviolence might work in some situations, but certainly against very cruel or very powerful or very well-armed and ruthless opponents, nonviolence isn't a realistic option. And to these challenges, I wanted to share the work of Erica Chenoweth. And some of you may be familiar with Chenoweth. They're a social scientist who started out in military studies, an ROTC student, but ended up in a seminar, a symposium series, I believe, that had collected people who were researchers in the area of nonviolent action. And in this clip that I'll play, Chenoweth describes her experience at this workshop when she is really being challenged about some of the ideas that Chenoweth held about violence and nonviolence. So let me see if I can switch then to this video. Okay, so where we begin in this TED Talk, Chenoweth is describing all of the evidence that the researchers had presented about different kinds of nonviolent action. So the methodologies that Virginia has just shared of non-cooperation, protest and persuasion, and nonviolent direct action.
At the workshop, I said stuff like, well, those were probably exceptions. For every successful case you guys bring up, I can think of a failed case like Tiananmen Square. I can also think of plenty of cases where violence worked pretty well, like the Russian, French, and Algerian
The
revolution.
sound is really quiet, Katy. Are you sharing sound?
Gender rights,
Yes.
labor rights.
Let me back up and try this again.
At the workshop, I said stuff like, well, those were probably exceptions. For every successful case you guys
Katy,
bring
mute your mic for a moment.
Tiananmen Square. I can also think of plenty of cases where violence worked pretty well, like the Russian, French, and Algerian revolutions. Maybe nonviolent resistance works if you're seeking environmental reforms, gender rights, labor rights, but it can't work generally if you're trying to overthrow a dictator or become a new country. And it definitely can't work if the authoritarian leader you're facing is not incompetent, is somebody who's really brutal and ruthless. So by the end of the week, as you can imagine, I wasn't very popular. But my soon-to-be co-author, Maria Steffen, came up to me and said something like, if you're right, why don't you prove it? Are you curious enough to study this in a serious way empirically? Now, believe it or not, nobody had really done that before systematically. And although I was still skeptical, I was curious. I figured that if they were right and I was wrong, somebody better find out. So for the next 2 years, I collected data on all major nonviolent and violent campaigns for the overthrow of a government or territorial liberation since 1900. The data cover the entire world and consist of every known case where there were at least 1,000 observed participants. This is hundreds of cases. Then I analyzed the data, and the results blew me away. From 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent insurgencies. And there's more. This trend has been increasing over time, so that in the last 50 years, nonviolent campaigns are becoming increasingly successful and common, whereas violent insurgencies are becoming increasingly rare and unsuccessful. This is true even in those extremely brutal authoritarian conditions where I expected nonviolent resistance to fail. So why is civil resistance so much more effective than armed struggle? The answer seems to lie in people power itself. Researchers used to say that no government could survive if just 5% of its population rose up against it. Our data show that the number may be lower than that. No single campaigns failed during that time period after they'd achieved the active and sustained participation of just 3.5% of the population. And lots of them succeeded with far fewer than that. Now, 3.5% is nothing to sneeze at. In the US today, that's like 11 million people. But get this, every single campaign that surpassed that 3.5% was a nonviolent one. In fact, the nonviolent campaigns were on average 4 times larger than the average violent campaigns. And they were often much more inclusive and representative in terms of gender, age, race, political party, class, and the urban-rural distinction. Civil resistance allows people of all different levels of physical ability to participate. So this can include the elderly, people with disabilities, women, children, and anyone else who wants to. If you think about it, everyone is born with a natural physical ability to resist nonviolently. Anyone here who has kids knows how hard it is to pick up a child who doesn't want to move, or to feed a child who doesn't want to eat. Violent resistance, on the other hand, is a little more physically demanding, and that makes it a little bit more exclusive.
So here, just to lift up a few points that Chenoweth offers to counter this skepticism that nonviolence is less effective or can only be effective in certain contexts against certain types of opponents. Chenoweth's research, and they're an empiricist, right? A social scientist empiricist, and partnered with Maria Stefan to do this research, looked at all of the mass social movements of the 20th century. And by definition there was looking at movements that included more than 1,000 participants. These are really broad scale movements. There were hundreds of different examples that they looked at in this study. And they found that nonviolent campaigns were twice as likely to succeed as those campaigns that use violence. And nonviolence was more successful and more common even in the most brutal of contexts. Right? And one of the reasons provided here is that nonviolent campaigns are able to include more people and involve more of a variety of tactics than violent campaigns can do. So one more clip, and then we'll move on to the next slide.
Settles. Well, it turns out that the way you resist matters in the long run too. Most strikingly, countries in which people waged nonviolent struggle were way more likely to emerge with democratic institutions than countries in which they waged violent struggle. And those countries with nonviolent campaigns were 15% less likely to relapse into civil war. The data are clear. When people rely on civil resistance, their size grows. And when large numbers of people remove their cooperation from an oppressive system, the odds are ever in their favor. So, I and many others like me had ignored the millions of people worldwide who were skillfully using civil resistance in favor of studying just things that blow up. I was left with a few questions about the way I used to think. Why was it so easy and comfortable for me to think that violence works? And why did I find it acceptable to assume that violence happens almost automatically because of circumstances or by necessity, that it's the only way out of some situations? In a society that celebrates battlefield heroes on national holidays, I guess it was natural to grow up believing that violence and courage are one and the same. and that true victories cannot come without bloodshed on both sides. But the evidence I've presented here today suggests that for people serious about seeking change, there are realistic alternatives. Imagine what our world would look like now if we allowed ourselves to develop some faith in them. What if our history courses emphasized the decade of mass civil disobedience that came before the Declaration of Independence, rather than the war that came after? What if our social studies textbooks emphasized Gandhi and King in the first chapter, rather than that as an afterthought? And what if every child left elementary school knowing more about the suffragist movement than they did about the Battle of Bunker Hill? What if it became common knowledge that when protest becomes too dangerous, there are many nonviolent techniques of dispersion that might keep movements safe and active? Okay, so here we are, 2013 in Boulder, Colorado. Maybe some of you are thinking, that's great that civil resistance works, and what can I do? Encourage your children to learn more about the nonviolent legacies of the past 200 years and explore the potential of people power. Tell your elected representatives to stop perpetuating the misguided view that violence pays by supporting the first groups in a civil uprising who take up arms. Although civil resistance cannot be exported or imported, it's time for our officials to embrace a different way of thinking. That in both the short and longer term, civil resistance tends to leave behind societies in which people can live more freely and more peaceably together. Now that we know what we know about the power of nonviolent conflict, I see it as our shared responsibility to spread the word so that future generations don't fall for the myth that violence is their only way out. Thank you.
So many buttons to push. Okay. Yes, I absolutely can provide, Virginia and I can give you links to that. Chenoweth's TED Talk with the accompanying charts available with an easy Google search. And this is a little bit dated now. The statistics have been updated. But the results of that research are clearly compelling that even in the most repressive regimes, the likelihood a nonviolent protest succeeding over a violent one more than twice as likely. And as Chenoweth notes here, the kinds of leaders that are nurtured in a nonviolent movement are the kinds of leaders that will sustain a societal change once a revolution is accomplished. Right? So even of the violent revolutions that were successful, the violent movements that did achieve an overthrow of a repressive regime, we find that the structures that are put into place after a violent action are much less stable because the civilian structure that is required for long-lasting social change hasn't been developed in the course of the movement. A second line of skepticism is this idea that violence is a sociological inevitability. And Susan is already nodding. Susan knows what this line of skepticism is about. And there are two levels. I want to talk about both of them. But I want to start at the level of human society, looking at there have always been wars and rumors of wars. And the example that I want us to take inspiration from is a cultural anthropologist named Margaret Mead, who has a remarkable body of research, but is also known for this piece called Warfare is a Bad Invention, in which she draws upon her anthropological work and her cultural studies of different peoples and different traditions around the world to really problematize this assumption that every culture has known warfare, and that all peoples, as soon as we come together to form societies, that there are levels of violence that happen when we scale up from small societies to large societies. She says that just based upon her research, what she has observed and what she has studied, warfare is not, and violence is not a biological necessity or a sociological inevitability, because we have traditions that are very pacifistic, very nonviolent. And she also says that there's a clear separation between the level of violence within a society and specifically this concept of war, right? Because we can have societies such as the Hopi in the Southwest, traditions that were very peaceful in terms of their inner relationships, but definitely had a concept of war when it came to neighboring nations, neighboring native peoples. She says there's an ability for us to distinguish whether or not violence is common or accepted or part of a cultural tradition in this particular concept of war that we see developing among peoples or across peoples. And from this study, she concludes that warfare, instead of being this necessity or inevitability, is a bad invention. And therefore is something that can be replaced if two things happen. We recognize that this is a bad practice and we have something to replace it with. We need both of those things in order to move on from a practice that isn't serving us. The example she gives in this piece, Warfare is a Bad Invention, is the example of the transition from trial by fire to trial by jury, right? That's another example of how societies have moved away from a practice that isn't serving us well anymore. And the final point of skepticism that I wanted to examine with you is this assumption that violence is part of human nature. And for this, I have, well, one of my favorite people. Like, my father said that Howard Zinn had one of the best smiles in the peace movement. And I think that's true. He's really inspiring in the way that he used history to counter the assumptions that people have about violence and nonviolence. So I want to share this clip on Howard Zinn in his own words about the connection between violence and human nature. So let me stop sharing this.
I always found when in any discussion on war, inevitably, in any discussion on war, at a certain point in the discussion, somebody would say, oh, well, it's human.
Katy, again, I can hardly hear that at all. I don't know if you can adjust it.
Well, first of all, from my own experience, inevitably, in any discussion on war, at a certain point in the discussion, somebody would say, oh, well, it's human nature. Well, first of all, from my own experience, and I still have to tell this to people because there are still people who talk about the desire of young men to go to war, the thrill it is for young men to be in war, to shoot their guns, to kill. And I thought about my own experience in the Air Force, and it was very clear to me, looking around at all these guys around me who were dropping bombs and who were killing people, that did not come from inside. It did not come from, oh, God, how good it would be to kill some people today. You know, there was no urge to kill, even though they were the enemy. No. What it came from was simply we had been trained. And also we had been told it's a good war. We had been told we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. It'll be bad if they won, it'll be good if we win. We've got to drop the bombs. And so we'll do it, and we'll do it as well as we can. But there was no spontaneous urge to kill. I mean, so that was my own, sort of my own personal experience, simply recoiled at the idea that soldiers have this kind of killing instinct, or the young men have this killing instinct. And then when I got away from my own experiences and just began to study history and history of wars, something else became clear to me. And that is, wars don't take place out of the rush of a population demanding war. It isn't the population that demands war, it's the leaders who demand war and who prepare the population for war. I mean, it's World War I. I mean, you didn't have the American people clamoring for the United States to go to war. Not at all. In fact, if anything, it was the opposite. People did not want to go to war. That's why Woodrow Wilson, when he was campaigning in 1916, the war in Europe was on, and the question was, will the United States get into it? And Wilson, campaigning in 1916, and knowing that this would be a popular thing to say, said no. We are not going to go to war. Then he's elected, and then almost immediately he calls upon the nation to go to war. But the nation doesn't respond immediately. If there was a spontaneous urge to kill, why would we need a draft? We would just take advantage of the natural desire of people to kill and give them an opportunity. But no, you have to draft people. Well, you have to do two things, really, in order to mobilize an army for war. You have to persuade them that this is a good thing to do, a noble thing to do. And you have to work very hard to persuade them, because after all, they're going to risk their lives. And so in World War I, a massive propaganda campaign was mounted by the Wilson administration. You know, they hired the #1 sort of public relations person in the country to organize, 75,000 speakers to go around the country to give speeches everywhere in the country. And the war spirit was built up. And the atrocity stories, the Huns, the Kaiser, really inflaming the public. Only then, was it possible to really mobilize the nation for war.
And Katy, there you go.
I'm gonna stop this there. But Zen draws upon his expertise as a historian to really demonstrate the ways that that violence has been portrayed as an element of human nature. when really history doesn't indicate that. In fact, history indicates that a lot of investment of resources and time has to go into compelling people to kill each other. If it were part of human nature, there wouldn't have needed to be encouragement in the Milgram experiments to get people to inflict shock all the way up to 450 events. If violence were an inevitable part of human nature, we wouldn't have to invest the kinds of resources that we do in order to train people to kill. So I want to leave with this, this example then of the ways that really nonviolence could be seen as the more of our default tool, and that acting in collaboration to change the world nonviolently is truer to our history and truer to our nature.
And thank you all so much for being here and taking the time to think about these things. And I hope that those kind of tools that Katy left us with at the end, some responses to arguments about violence, will be useful to you going forward, and talking about these issues with folks who might feel like violence is for some reason necessary or inevitable. We're past our time. We're 5 minutes over. So I'll let you all go. If you want to throw in chat something you're taking with you, a lingering question, if there's any resources I've noted down to share with you all, the Chenoweth TED Talk and maybe some of Gladys Muir's papers from that first session. If there's anything you'd like to share that you'll be taking with you, that you learned, that you're going to look into more, would be happy to hear those in the chat. But otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your participation and your dedication and your time and your ears. So thank you so much.
I don't know if you saw my last comment, but I think you should add that, our acts of kindness and service and humanitarian, what we see with the refugees, people pulling together, is a wonderful form of nonviolence in a way that might unite people to stand up for a change that, I don't know, it's inspiring me with Ukraine, think of all the people in Poland helping.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like some of the things that we've brought up together are kind of these expressions of solidarity as a form of nonviolence. And that, I think, is a wonderful thing to give us hope in the midst of violence and conflict. So thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.